Deep in the quiet farmlands of Plainfield, Wisconsin, a darkness was growing, unnoticed, hidden behind polite smiles and ordinary chores. A man lived among the townspeople, quiet, shy, harmless in appearance. But behind the walls of his farmhouse, a world of obsession, horror, and death was quietly taking shape. This is the story of Ed Gein, the butcher of Plainfield, a man whose grief, isolation, and devotion to a mother would twist into acts so grotesque, so unimaginable, that they would shock a nation. From lonely childhood to grave robbing, and finally murder, Ed Gein's life is a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight. In this documentary, we will uncover the full story, chapter by chapter, exploring the life, crimes, and mind of one of the most infamous true criminals in American history. This is the real horror behind the butcher of Plainfield. The lonely boy. In the early 1900s, deep in the quiet farmland of Wisconsin, a child named Edward Theodore Gein was born into a world that was already broken. The town was small. Everyone knew everyone. But even among them, the Gein family was different. Strange, distant, and feared. Ed was born in 1906, the second son of George and Augusta Gein. His father was a failed carpenter and alcoholic who stumbled through life with anger and shame. His mother, Augusta, ruled the family with an iron grip and a twisted sense of religion. To her, the world was full of sin. She told her sons that women, except herself, were instruments of the devil, temptresses that led men to ruin. She filled their days with scripture, sermons, and punishment. Ed and his brother Henry were not allowed to have friends. They were not allowed to visit other homes, to attend dances, or to speak freely with girls. Their childhood was built on fear and obedience. Each morning, Augusta would gather her sons and read to them from the Bible. Not the comforting parts, but the violent ones. Stories of death, vengeance, and eternal damnation. She wanted her sons to believe the world was doomed, and only she could guide them to salvation. To Ed, she wasn't just a mother, she was a god. And like any god, she demanded total devotion. While other children in Plainfield went to the movies or played outside, Ed stayed home, trapped in his mother's shadow. He spent long hours cleaning the house, cooking meals, and listening to her endless rants about sin and women. When he did leave the farm, he was awkward and shy. He didn't look people in the eyes. He laughed at the wrong times. The townspeople called him strange, but harmless. At school, the teachers noticed something odd. Ed did well in reading and spelling, but he struggled with people. He couldn't understand jokes or sarcasm. He was bullied often, mocked for his quietness. When that happened, Augusta didn't comfort him. She scolded him. She told him to never fight back, to turn the other cheek, and to pray for the wicked children who teased him. At night, when the house was silent, Ed would sit in his room surrounded by newspapers and old books. He read about anatomy, death, and ancient burial practices. He became fascinated with the thin line between life and death, what happens after the soul leaves the body. But he kept those thoughts secret, afraid his mother would call him evil. The years went on, and the family sank deeper into isolation. George's drinking grew worse. The farm, once lively, became a prison, and Augusta's sermons grew darker, filled with rage at the world she despised. To her, the outside world was filthy, a place of corruption, so she locked her sons away from it, convinced she was protecting them. But isolation does not protect, it decays. Inside that quiet farmhouse, far from the laughter of other children, Ed Gein learned to love silence. He learned to live inside his imagination, where the only voice that mattered was his mother's. By the time Ed reached his teenage years, his father was a ghost in the house, his brother restless, and his mother still unyielding. He had no friends, no lovers, and no sense of the world beyond those four walls. He helped with farm chores, read books about corpses and explorers, and obeyed every command his mother gave him. Neighbors would later say Ed seemed gentle, polite even. He did odd jobs for people in town. He fixed fences, shoveled snow, and helped on small farms. He never cursed, never argued, never raised his voice. But behind his calm face was a growing void, a loneliness so deep it began to twist into something unnatural. That loneliness became the seed of what would come later, the horror that would turn Plainfield into a name spoken in whispers. Because in the silence of that small farmhouse, Ed Gein wasn't just learning obedience. He was learning to live without human connection. And when his mother's love was gone, he would do anything to feel it again, even if it meant bringing her back from the dead. The first death. By 1940, the Gein family farm had grown colder, darker, and emptier. George Gein, Ed's father, had finally drunk himself into an early grave. When he died, no one in Plainfield seemed surprised. He had been a bitter man, useless in the eyes of his wife, Augusta, and forgotten by the townsfolk. His death left the two brothers, Ed and Henry, alone with the one person they feared and worshipped the most, their mother. Ed was 38, but he was still a boy in spirit, still living under Augusta's command. He obeyed her without question, caring for her every need. She had raised him to see the world as evil and women as the root of all sin. He believed her completely. Henry, however, had begun to see through their mother's hold. He had started to think for himself. He talked about moving away, finding work, even meeting a woman. He said things that would have made Augusta furious, calling her sermons crazy and her faith twisted. Ed didn't like hearing those words. To him, they weren't just insults, they were blasphemy. In the spring of 1944, a brush fire broke out on the edges of the Gein property. The two brothers went out to fight it, swinging shovels and stamping at the flames. Smoke filled the air, and darkness came quickly. Later that evening, Ed walked into town alone. He told the sheriff that he'd lost track of his brother in the fire. A search party was formed, and with Ed's help, they went looking. But something was strange. Before they even began searching, Ed led them directly to the body. Henry was lying on the ground, face up, untouched by the fire. He had bruises on his head, marks that didn't fit the story of an accidental death. The sheriff examined the body, but decided not to question it further. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation. No autopsy was performed. Ed said very little. He stood quietly, watching as they took his brother's body away. When neighbors asked him what had happened, he gave the same answer every time. It was an accident. But in the days that followed, something in Ed's eyes changed. He was calm, almost relieved. Now Augusta was his alone. No one could challenge her voice or steal her attention. Henry's death erased the only person who might have saved Ed from what he would become. After the funeral, Augusta's health began to fail. She suffered a stroke and grew weaker by the day. Ed became her caretaker, tending to her every need. He cooked for her, cleaned for her, and sat by her bedside for hours. He prayed with her. He listened as she told him again and again that women were filthy, that the world was doomed, that he must stay pure. In those final months, she was his whole world. When she died in 1945, Ed's world ended too. He didn't cry at the funeral. He simply stood still, as if waiting for someone to tell him what to do next. But no one did. Now, the house was silent. No footsteps, no sermons, just the wind against the windows and the creak of the old wooden floor. For the first time in his life, Ed Gein was alone. At first, he tried to keep the house as it was. He boarded up his mother's room, sealing it off like a shrine. He wouldn't let anyone in. The furniture, the curtains, the bed, everything stayed untouched. It became a frozen world, a time capsule of the only person he had ever loved. The rest of the farmhouse began to rot around it. Trash piled up, wallpaper peeled, and dust grew thick. Ed lived in the kitchen and a small side room, surrounded by clutter, silence, and his memories. He began to read strange books, stories about grave robbers, body snatchers, and cannibal tribes. He read about anatomy, mummification, and human experiments. He was no longer afraid of death. He was curious about it. He wanted to understand what happens after the body dies. But more than that, he wanted his mother back. He missed her voice. He missed her presence. And in his loneliness, that longing started to turn into something far darker, a desire not just to remember her, but to recreate her. The fire that took Henry's life had opened a door inside Ed Gein. It was the first death that didn't horrify him. It was the first death that made him feel powerful. And soon, he would cross the line from curiosity to creation, from loneliness to horror. The mother's curse. When Augusta Gein died, something inside Ed Gein snapped. It didn't happen all at once. It was slow, like a shadow creeping over a man's soul. For nearly 40 years, every thought, every word, every rule had come from her. She had told him what was good, what was evil, and who to fear. She was his world, and now that world was gone. After the funeral, Ed wandered the farmhouse aimlessly. He spoke to the walls, as if expecting her voice to answer. He kept her Bible open on the kitchen table. At night, he slept in a small, filthy corner of the house, while his mother's room, perfectly clean and sealed, remained untouched. It became a sacred space. He would not enter it. He would not let the dust fall on her things. He told people that his mother was still there, and in his mind, she was. Plainfield didn't notice much at first. Ed still did small jobs for people. He fixed fences, shoveled snow, and babysat children. People found him strange, but harmless. He spoke softly, rarely looked people in the eye, and often laughed at things no one else found funny. When asked about his family, he'd say, "Just me and the farm." No one knew what that farm had become, a tomb of silence. Inside, the walls began to rot. Food spoiled in cans. Dead rodents lay under the floorboards. The smell of decay hung in the air. But in the locked room, Augusta's room, everything was perfect. Ed dusted it every week. He polished her mirror, folded her clothes, and whispered prayers. He could not let go. Loneliness twisted his mind. He began spending long nights reading old books and magazines, articles about anatomy, headhunters, and the occult. He was drawn to the idea of resurrection, the belief that the dead could live again if properly restored. The thought comforted him. He began to imagine ways his mother could be brought back, not in spirit, but in body. Ed started listening to the radio late at night. He loved horror stories and crime reports. But one topic caught his attention more than any other: grave robbing. When local newspapers reported a burial, he would cut out the article and keep it. He wanted to know where the body was, what the woman looked like, how old she was. He was drawn only to women who reminded him of Augusta, middle-aged, strong-featured, plain-looking. In 1947, 2 years after his mother's death, Ed began his nighttime journeys. He waited until the moon was high and the town asleep. He would dress in heavy clothes, take a lantern, and walk to the cemetery. He dug into fresh graves, graves of women who had recently died, and opened their coffins. He would take what he wanted and leave the rest. He claimed later that most nights he would come to his senses and cover the grave back up before finishing. But other nights, he took souvenirs home. He wasn't doing it for money. He wasn't doing it for pleasure. He was doing it out of obsession, a belief that if he could gather enough pieces, he could feel his mother's presence again. He didn't see it as evil. He saw it as reunion. Over time, his collection grew. He experimented with skin, bones, and organs. He studied how they dried, how they changed. He learned how to preserve them. His farmhouse became a laboratory of death, and in his mind, it was holy work. He was restoring what God had taken away. But Ed's loneliness still deepened. The more he tried to recreate his mother, the more he realized he could never truly bring her back. So he began to dream of becoming her, to wear her, to move like her, to be her. He started sewing together pieces of skin into a kind of clothing, a vest, gloves, a mask. He called it his woman's suit. In that suit, he could step into her image and feel her voice again. It gave him comfort. It gave him purpose. It gave him power. Neighbors began to notice his odd behavior. He stopped bathing regularly. He spoke to himself in public. Children he once babysat said they didn't like the way he stared at them. But Plainfield was a small, trusting town. They shrugged it off. To them, Ed Gein was just a quiet old bachelor who kept to himself. No one suspected that behind the locked doors of that farmhouse was a collection of horrors. Masks made of human skin, skulls turned into bowls, lips sewn into window shades. No one imagined that the gentle handyman had turned his grief into madness. Augusta's curse lived on, not as a ghost, but as an idea buried in her son's mind. Her words, her hatred, her control, her fear of women had not died with her. They had been absorbed, preserved, and reborn through Ed himself. And soon, that curse would lead him to cross another line. Not just to dig up the dead, but to make new ones. The grave robber of Plainfield. The town of Plainfield slept soundly each night, unaware that one of their own was walking among the graves. The cemeteries surrounding the quiet Wisconsin farmland were peaceful, still, and holy to the families who buried their loved ones there. But to Ed Gein, there was something else entirely. Places of possibility, where death could be undone and devotion reborn. He started visiting the graveyards late at night, carrying a lantern and a shovel. He moved with care, avoiding the main paths, his breath visible in the cold air. He would stop at certain graves, always freshly filled, always of women. He read the names on the headstones, whispered prayers, and then began to dig. He said later that sometimes he fell into a trance, that he didn't even know why he was doing it until the coffin was open before him. The moonlight would reveal the pale face of a woman who had once been alive, and in those moments he felt a strange peace, as if his mother's presence had returned to him. Sometimes, he said, he covered the grave again, untouched. Other times, he couldn't resist. He took parts of the body, a head, a piece of skin, or bones, and carried them home in burlap sacks. At first, he tried to preserve what he found with salt and oil, learning from old medical books. He experimented, trying to understand how to make the flesh last, how to keep the faces from fading. He said he didn't see the dead as people anymore. They were pieces, fragments of a single image he wanted to rebuild. He wasn't killing, not yet. He was collecting. Inside his farmhouse, his work grew more daring. He turned his small kitchen into a workshop, his table into a dissection bench. He hung lamps from the ceiling, made from skins stretched over wire. He crafted bowls from skulls, decorated chairs with human hide. The house smelled of decay and chemicals. Flies gathered in the corners. But to Ed, it wasn't horror. It was sacred creation. He believed he was transforming death into life, building a bridge between himself and his mother. He began to talk less to the townspeople and more to himself. Neighbors noticed him muttering while walking through the streets, laughing softly at nothing. He still helped with odd jobs and occasionally visited the local tavern, but he avoided close contact. He was polite, gentle, and always alone. When people teased him, he smiled as if he didn't understand the joke. Rumors started to spread. Some said Ed had a strange smell coming from his house. Others said they saw him walking in the fields at night with a lantern. But no one took it seriously. This was Plainfield, a town where nothing bad ever happened. Around this time, a woman named Mary Hogan, who owned a tavern nearby, went missing. Her bar was found closed, her purse still behind the counter, and a trail of blood led out the back door. Locals speculated she had run off with a man, or perhaps been kidnapped. No one suspected Ed. When someone joked that Mary was probably hanging in Ed's shed, he laughed and said, "She's not missing, she's down at my place right now." Everyone laughed too, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. By the early 1950s, Ed's farmhouse had become a museum of death. The rooms were cluttered with bones, preserved organs, and masks made from faces. He crafted a vest stitched from the torsos of women, complete with breasts. He would wear it under his clothes, look in a mirror, and pretend to be his mother. Sometimes he spoke to himself in her voice, scolding himself the way she used to. He believed she could see him, could hear him, that she approved of what he was doing. In his mind, he was not a murderer or a madman. He was a son continuing his mother's will, keeping her spirit alive through creation, through imitation, through flesh. But the bodies he took from graves began to lose their power. They were cold, lifeless, and distant. The illusion of resurrection began to fade. And soon, Ed realized that the only way to truly bring her back was not to find the dead, but to make new ones. Plainfield still slept peacefully, unaware that the man who fixed their fences and shoveled their snow was preparing to take the next step. The grave robber of Plainfield was about to become something far worse. The final murder. By November 1957, the town of Plainfield was still largely unaware of the horror that had been quietly unfolding in Ed Gein's farmhouse for over a decade. Neighbors knew him as a quiet, polite man, the handyman who fixed fences, shoveled snow, and occasionally helped with odd jobs. No one suspected the true nature of his obsession. No one imagined that behind his calm demeanor was a house full of human remains, a workshop of death, and a mind unraveling completely. It began with Bernice Wardens, a 58-year-old hardware store owner in the town. She was practical, strong-willed, and well-liked. She closed her store for the night, turned off the lights, and went home, never to be seen alive again. The next day, her son, a local deputy, realized the cash register tape ended abruptly. He noted Ed Gein's name as someone who had recently been in the store. When police went to question Ed, he seemed unusually calm. He answered their questions politely, smiled at the officers, and led them back to his farmhouse. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But as they entered, the smell hit them, a foul, choking odor of decay that immediately raised alarms. In the shed behind the farmhouse, they found Bernice Warden's body. She was hung upside down, completely gutted like a slaughtered deer, her skull partially removed. Inside the house, investigators discovered a collection of unimaginable horror. A lamp made from human skin, stretched and dried over a wire frame. A skull turned into a bowl, polished and hollowed out. A belt made from nipples, sewn together with crude thread. Boxes filled with body parts, organs, and skulls. Masks of women's faces, carefully preserved. It was a scene straight from a nightmare. A gruesome collection that defied reason. Ed Gein admitted to killing Bernice Wardens, and also confessed to the murder of Mary Hogan, the tavern owner who had vanished years earlier. But he insisted that most of the bodies he had taken from graves were already dead. He did not see himself as a killer, he said. He was a caretaker of the dead, preserving women who reminded him of his mother. Investigators struggled to process what they were seeing. They had heard stories of grave robbers, of cannibals, of body snatchers. But nothing prepared them for the methodical nature of Ed Gein's work. The calm precision, the sheer scale, the personal devotion embedded in each act. Inside the house, the collection of human remains told a story of obsession and devotion turned to madness. Each mask, each piece of furniture, each woman's suit was a reflection of his longing for the mother he had lost. In his mind, he was not evil. He was trying to recreate what he had loved most in life. The line between grief and insanity had disappeared entirely. Plainfield was stunned. The mild-mannered handyman they had laughed with and trusted had been hiding a decade of horrors in plain sight. Neighbors could not reconcile the quiet man they knew with the butcher revealed by the police. Ed Gein was arrested and charged with murder. He did not resist. He answered every question politely, explained his actions, and admitted his crimes without hesitation. But in his mind, he had done nothing wrong. Only what he felt was necessary to bring his mother back, to feel her presence, to fill the unbearable emptiness left by her absence. The discovery of Bernice Warden's murder was not just the capture of a killer. It was the unveiling of a world of obsession, isolation, and madness that had festered unnoticed for years. The butcher of Plainfield had finally been exposed, and the quiet farmhouse that had seemed ordinary to the townspeople was revealed to be a house of horrors beyond imagination. Ed Gein's crimes would shock the world, inspire some of the most infamous horror films in history, and leave an enduring legacy of fear and fascination. The House of Horrors. When investigators stepped inside Ed Gein's farmhouse, they entered a world that defied belief. To the casual eye, it looked like an ordinary farmhouse, cluttered, worn, and silent. But the closer they looked, the more they realized nothing inside was ordinary. The floors were covered in dust, animal pelts, and broken furniture. The air was thick with the smell of decay, rotting flesh, and chemicals he had used to preserve his grim collection. Every room held a fragment of his obsession, a physical manifestation of his grief, loneliness, and twisted devotion to his mother. In the kitchen, the investigators found skulls turned into bowls and candle holders. Human skin had been stretched over lampshades, forming grotesque lighting that cast shadows across the walls. Leather belts and straps were crafted from human nipples, sewn together with crude thread. Boxes filled with bones, preserved organs, and severed heads were stacked in corners, meticulously arranged. The bedroom was perhaps the most chilling. Here, Ed had kept his mother's room perfectly intact, as if she were still alive. He never entered it. It was a shrine, untouched by time. In other parts of the house, he had created his infamous woman's suit, a full body garment made of stitched-together human skin. He would wear this suit at night, looking in the mirror, imagining himself as his mother. The walls of the house were lined with newspapers, books, and articles about anatomy, grave robbing, and occult practices. He had studied obsessively, learning how to remove skin, preserve it, and shape it into functional objects. Every object told a story, not of violence for pleasure, but of obsession, longing, and a mind unmoored from reality. When officers spoke to Ed, he explained his actions calmly. He did not hide or resist. He said he had taken bodies to recreate his mother, to feel her presence again. He spoke of her as if she were still alive, guiding his hands, approving his work. The scene was so surreal that some investigators questioned whether they were witnessing sanity or madness. Ed's crimes were not born of anger, greed, or lust. They were born of grief, isolation, and a warped sense of love. He had taken what he wanted from the dead to satisfy a need that the living could not fill. Neighbors and townspeople could not reconcile this vision of horror with the man they had known. The handyman, the polite neighbor, the quiet bachelor. The face of evil was hidden behind an ordinary mask. Ed Gein had lived among them for years, and no one had known the depth of his obsession. The farmhouse, later burned down by locals, became a symbol of the thin line between normalcy and monstrosity. A quiet man could harbor the unimaginable, and grief could mutate into acts that defy comprehension. The butcher of Plainfield was no longer just a name in the news. He was a living reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, and that human obsession, left unchecked, can twist into a reality far worse than any nightmare. The mind of a monster. Ed Gein was not what most people imagine when they think of a serial killer. He did not stalk the streets at night, seeking victims for thrill or lust. He did not act out of greed or rage. What made him terrifying, what made him a true horror, was the way his mind had been shaped by decades of isolation, fear, and obsession. Psychologists who examined Ed concluded that he was criminally insane. He suffered from a profound psychological disorder rooted in his childhood, the strict control of his mother, and years of social isolation. He had internalized her belief that women were evil, that sin was everywhere, and that the only path to salvation was total obedience. After his mother's death, the boundaries between reality and fantasy collapsed. He could no longer differentiate between the living and the dead, between himself and the person he revered most, Augusta. To him, grave robbing was not theft. It was devotion. Mutilation was not murder. It was preservation. Ed's obsession with his mother became all-consuming. He dressed in her image, created objects from human remains, and spoke to the dead as if they were alive. He claimed that wearing the skin of women allowed him to feel what it was like to be his mother, to embody her presence, to escape his unbearable loneliness. Experts later explained that Ed suffered from a rare combination of psychopathy and paraphilic disorders, meaning he had both antisocial tendencies and a fixation on death-related sexual fantasies. But unlike other criminals, his actions were not impulsive. They were deliberate, methodical, and ritualistic. He planned his grave robberies carefully, studied anatomy, and preserved human remains with precision. Yet despite this, he exhibited moments of innocence and politeness that confounded everyone who met him. Neighbors described him as gentle, shy, and helpful. Even after his arrest, he answered questions politely, admitted his crimes calmly, and appeared unaware of their full moral weight. He did not revel in violence. He did not take pleasure in terror. He acted out of grief, obsession, and a fractured understanding of reality. Ed Gein's mind was a labyrinth of trauma and devotion. Every corner of it was shaped by fear, control, and loss. The same mother who had nurtured and controlled him had created the monster he became. Her death did not end her influence. It intensified it, twisting him into a creature capable of acts that horrified a nation. Psychologists concluded that Ed was incapable of understanding normal human morality. He could not grasp that what he did was wrong in any conventional sense. In his world, the dead were tools, the body was material, and the mother was eternal. The Butcher of Plainfield reminds us that monsters are not always obvious. They do not always scream or strike. Sometimes they are quiet. Sometimes they are polite. Sometimes they're the child of fear and devotion, slowly warped by the invisible chains of obsession and trauma. The legend that never died. After Ed Gein's arrest in 1957, the world struggled to comprehend the horror that had occurred in Plainfield. The farmhouse, once a quiet home, was revealed as a shrine of death, filled with objects made from human remains, grotesque masks, and the infamous woman's suit. The Butcher of Plainfield was no longer a local mystery. He had become a symbol of a nightmare made real. Ed was tried for murder, but mental health experts determined he was criminally insane. He was not sentenced to death or life in prison like other murderers. Instead, he was confined to a mental institution where he would spend nearly 30 years of his life. Doctors documented his obsessive behaviors, his inability to distinguish reality from fantasy, and the profound psychological damage caused by his upbringing and isolation. Even behind bars, Ed's story captured the imagination and fear of the public. His crimes were bizarre, grotesque, and unlike anything most people had ever heard. They sparked debates about sanity, morality, and the nature of evil. How could a man who seemed gentle, quiet, and harmless commit acts of such unimaginable horror? Hollywood took notice. Ed Gein's life inspired some of the most iconic horror characters of all time. Norman Bates in Psycho, a man obsessed with his mother. Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a killer who wore human skin. Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs, a man trying to transform into someone else. These characters carried Ed Gein's influence into popular culture, transforming real-life horror into fictional terror. But the reality was far darker. Unlike movies, Ed's victims could not be resurrected for entertainment. Each skull, mask, and piece of human flesh was evidence of a mind twisted by isolation and obsession, a reminder that evil is not always loud or sensational. Plainfield itself struggled to recover. Locals were haunted by the knowledge that the quiet handyman they had trusted for years had lived among them, hiding horrors in plain sight. The farmhouse was eventually burned down by the community, an attempt to erase the memory of what had occurred there. Yet the story refused to die. It lived on in books, films, and documentaries, a cautionary tale about the destructive power of isolation, trauma, and obsession. Ed Gein died in 1984, still confined in a mental institution. He never expressed remorse in the conventional sense, nor did he show signs of rehabilitation. To him, his actions had been necessary, rational, and even loving, an attempt to reconnect with a mother who had defined his entire existence. The Butcher of Plainfield remains a chilling reminder. Monsters can live among us quietly, unnoticed, and ordinary appearances can hide the unimaginable. His legacy endures not because of the number of lives he took, but because of the depth of his obsession, the complexity of his mind, and the sheer horror of what one human being can do when grief and devotion twist into madness. Even today, decades later, the story of Ed Gein continues to haunt. It reminds us that horror is not always fiction. Sometimes, it walks quietly on our streets, in our towns, and even in the bodies of men who seem harmless, ordinary, and polite. The legend of the Butcher of Plainfield will never die, and the farmhouse, the graves, and the shadows of Plainfield will forever whisper the memory of Ed Gein, the man who turned grief into horror and devotion into monstrosity. Ed Gein's story did not end with his arrest. Even behind the walls of a mental institution, his name would live on, terrifying, fascinating, and haunting. His crimes inspired countless legends, films, and warnings about the darkness that can grow in isolation. The Butcher of Plainfield reminds us that evil is not always obvious. It can hide in quiet hands, polite smiles, and ordinary towns. It can grow from grief, obsession, and the twisted love of a mother. The farmhouse is gone, the victims are gone, but the story remains. And in the shadows of Plainfield, the memory of Ed Gein will forever linger, a warning, a legend, and a dark truth that refuses to die.